What if Germany had won World War I? Questions of this kind are often posed by historians to contemplate possible outcomes of historical events if certain events had unfolded differently. For example, World War I could have started 10 years earlier with a different set of coalitions. We would like to ponder this scenario as well. So, here's our take on what might have happened if Germany had won World War I. We look forward to hearing your suggestions for future videos and your feedback on this topic in the comments. It's better to start the story not with a recount of the war, but with why it began in the first place. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip was not the cause, but merely the trigger. Throughout history, many presidents, kings, and prominent figures were assassinated, leading to wars only in cases where those wars were already looming on the horizon. World War I is no exception. In fact, it serves as an exemplary case. Its roots can be traced back not even to the 20th century, but to the 19th, or perhaps even earlier. Germany, for various reasons, missed out on the colonial division of the world. For colonies, this meant horrors of exploitation, while for European states, it turned them into superpowers, enjoying the benefits of free labor from Asia and Africa. Utsa Patnaik, a renowned economist from New Delhi, made waves in 2018 with her extensive work on the topic of profiting from colonies. Her massive research, laden with numbers, statistics, and facts, estimated that from 1765 to 1938, Britain extracted goods worth $45 trillion from India. For a moment, this is half of the total global GDP in 2021. Even if the figures were inflated by half, India alone accounts for this colossal sum. Britain had dozens of colonies, and France is still embroiled in scandals regarding the theft of gold from Africa. As for Germany, a cursory glance at the map is enough to understand that the country was late to the colonial party, simply because Germany, as a state, only asserted itself after the unification in 1871 following the Franco-Prussian War. Rwanda, Botswana, parts of New Guinea, the Marshall Islands, and a couple of other territories were all that Germany got. And of course, when Germany made inquiries in Europe, they were met with surprised faces and declarations of inviolable borders. Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow best exemplified the situation.
Those times are past when a German could yield land to one neighbor, sea to another, leaving the sky to himself. We demand a place under the sun.
Tensions were rising, and World War I could have easily begun as early as 1906, perhaps with different teams. France and Britain formed the Entente in 1904, but there was no talk of joint wars. The agreement only divided the world into spheres of influence, and at the same time, Germany came close to forming an alliance with Russia. Nicholas II even signed an agreement, even though in those years the Russian Empire's relations with Britain were not very good. The Great Game continued, and clashes between ships of the Empire and Britain were commonplace. A Russia-Germany alliance seemed logical. However, there was a strong French lobby in Nicholas's government that prevented the agreements from taking effect. Germany then turned to Morocco, and in 1906, it promised to declare war on France if France granted independence to the country and allowed it to engage in free trade with Germany. Germany was denied, and World War I did not start only because Germany had absolute zero allies. At the Algeciras conference in Spain, Austria was the only country that supported Germany. Britain, realizing which way the wind was blowing, quickly resolved its differences with Russia. But when it came to Germany, it had to scrape together Turkey, Austria, Hungary, and other countries that would later be featured in textbooks as the Triple Alliance. It's essential to remember that there are no ideologies or principles in politics. The combinations of allied states in World War I could have been anything, and as a result, the first hypothetical plan for Germany's victory in the war emerges. Suppose the agreement on cooperation with the Russian Empire did take effect, or Germany somehow persuaded Russia to remain neutral. Could the Germans have emerged victorious in World War I? Most likely, yes. The famous Schlieffen Plan envisaged defeating France before Russia entered the war. It failed and was modified 30 times because Germany fought on two fronts from day one. If this front were singular, the Triple Alliance would have had 2 million extra bayonets, 2,000 light guns, and 4,000 heavy guns, considering that Germany even held the Western Front in 1918, concluding the war on foreign soil. It's clear that things would have been much worse for the Entente with all the forces of the Eastern Front. But then what? Almost certainly, Britain and Germany would not have been able to conquer each other due to sheer geography. France would have borne the brunt, and the closest historical analogy would be France's surrender in 1940. Many sympathize with Germany's situation during World War I, but it's important not to forget that we are talking about an ordinary state of its time, and with a high degree of probability. In the case of a military victory over France, the situation of World War II would simply have repeated itself 30 years earlier. Germany, with colonies, resources, and a dominant position in Europe, would almost certainly have turned its attention to Russia. No treaties, agreements, or past merits should be recalled. Everyone remembers what happened with similar documents before World War II. This is, of course, our humble opinion, but it is logical to assume that if Germany had gone to war with Russia, not in 1941, but in 1918, after the capitulation of France, the situation for Russia would have been much worse. It's not about the perennial disputes between the imperial power and the communists. It's about the fact that the technological gap between the Russian Empire and Germany in 1918 was much more significant. The factories that were relocated to Siberia in 1941 did not exist at that time, and progress at the time did not allow for the effective deployment of Lend-Lease and other Allied maneuvers during World War II. In general, there is a high probability that Germany would not have been content with the last independent rival in Europe, and with the same probability, the Russian Empire would have joined Germany's sphere of influence. Paradoxically, but such a scenario would have hit the United States the hardest. An isolated country on its own continent traditionally reaps the benefits of European conflicts. In 1913, the US had a negative trade balance. By 1917, it had reached a surplus of $10 billion. It was just a simple borrowing of money to allies. After World War I, Europe was rebuilt according to the Dawes and Young plans, which marked a period of prosperity in the American economy. All reparations before entering the balances of European countries passed through the United States. If Germany had won World War I, the news would have been terrible for the United States, but not to the extent one might think. The main point is that the debts incurred by France, Britain, and other members of the Entente after World War I would have been paid by Germany according to an informal agreement after the war. In reality, in 1920, Britain, through Prime Minister Lloyd George, asked the U.S. Treasury for a deferral because Germany couldn't pay on time. On November 3, 1920, Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, explained that he didn't care what was happening with Germany. England had to pay on time. As a result, all Britain achieved was a 62-year deferral of payments. According to many economists, this became one of the main reasons for the fall of the British Empire and its loss of superpower status. Germany couldn't pay reparations, and Britain, bankrupted after World War I, not only didn't receive reparations, but also paid the US. Interestingly, in the scenario of Germany's victory, nothing would have changed. Only France would have been removed from the equation, and instead of the US, Britain would have been paying Germany. Britain would have remained in the sphere of US influence, helping boost the economy of the transatlantic country. Can you feel what's in the air? Yes, the Cold War, which in our humble opinion would have started 30 years earlier, only instead of the USSR, the USA would have faced Germany. Moreover, its resources and potential would have looked no weaker than that of the USSR. Hitler, with his Jewish tricks, would definitely have been out of the equation because, in real history, Adolf rose to power on a platform of revenge, and without Hitler and the persecution of Jews, Germany's scientific achievements would have soared. For a moment, it was German scientists who pioneered nuclear and rocket industries. It's just that, due to Hitler, all Jewish scientists were scattered around the world, and rocket scientists were claimed by the victorious powers after World War II. The USA also had a few aces up its sleeve, at least in terms of geography. After all, no matter how you twist it, it's easier to destabilize a country that shares borders with dozens of countries than one located on another continent with Canada and Mexico on either side. The hypothetical scenario of a Cold War between the USA and Germany is a different story altogether, nearly impossible to predict. But one thing can be said for sure: the conflict would have been no less intense than the struggle between the USA and the USSR in the real world. It's worth mentioning that we chose the most realistic scenario for a possible German victory. If we take into account how events unfolded in the real world, there simply were no conditions for the Triple Alliance to win. The Entente had too much of an advantage, both in terms of manpower and industry. But even if we assume that by some incredible turn of events the Germans managed to win, the situation would have ended up more or less the same as we described. Britain would be isolated on its island, drowning in debt to the USA. France would capitulate, Europe would fall under German domination, and a new Cold War would unfold. There are, however, a couple of other interesting facts. First, the Ottoman Empire, which would have survived in this scenario as a satellite of Germany. Imperialism in general would have persisted on Earth for a bit longer. In reality, World War I became the graveyard of empires, finally killing killing off monarchies as a phenomenon. If imperialist Germany had won, elitist regimes would have endured a bit longer, and the evolution of military technology might have taken a different path. Submarines became popular precisely because Germany needed something unique to cause problems for its allies, while dealing with its own fleet issues in World War II. Rockets, on the other hand, might not have taken off. After all, their progress was tied to the dreams of Nazi Germany, hopelessly losing in World War II about miracle weapons that would win them all. In general, there is plenty of room for imagination here, and if you have interesting thoughts, please feel free to share them in the comments.